Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. The aisles throughout the modern supermarkets have become a testament to a pervasive nutritional ideology. The more protein, the better. Protein-fortified waters, yogurts, energy bars, even coffee and juices seem to brag about the amount of protein contained in their products. The macronutrient that once resided primarily in the domain of serious athletes and bodybuilders, or those who were on specialized weight loss programs, has now infiltrated mainstream products, mainstream beverages. But is there a scientifically valid argument to this trend, or is it just another nutrition fad? What are the purported benefits and potential drawbacks, the scientific evidence or lack thereof supporting claims, and the broader implication for public health and consumer behaviors? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
The rise that we see in protein-fortified foods and beverages is not an isolated phenomenon. It's a symptom of a larger cultural shift. A society that is increasingly fixated on health, on fitness, on optimizing performance. Protein has ascended to a godlike status. The perception that we have of protein as building blocks for muscles, as keys to being full, as an essential nutrient for weight management, and for putting off the ills of aging. This perception has been meticulously cultivated by marketing campaigns that are reinforced by social media influencers and has created fertile ground for the proliferation of protein-centric products, protein-centric diets. Consumers bombarded with messages about the importance of a protein, of importance of a specific protein, of importance of amino acids, are essentially seeking out convenient ways to increase their intake, whether it is in prepackaged meals, ready-to-drink beverages, or easily mixable protein options. It has become an obvious solution for a problem that is not a problem. The appeal of adding proteins to drinks, especially in powdered forms, lies in an unparalleled amount of convenience. Individuals with busy lives, the idea that simply scooping in a thing of protein will somehow allow them to meet all of their nutritional needs. Simply shaking a scoop of protein into their water bottle, blending it into a smoothie, it offers a quick, effortless way to boost protein intake without understanding how much protein they actually need, without needing to prepare a whole meal, without understanding the benefits that can come from having this protein powder versus eating whole foods. The perception of attractiveness that we get from adding protein, particularly those who struggle to meet their protein needs through whole foods alone, through the use of dietary restrictions in an attempt to meet an ideal about body weight, where we somehow have so many time constraints on our ability to consume foods, has led to this appeal for these protein-ready drinks, for these powders that we can add to what we regularly consume. And it could even simply be the fact that we lack culinary expertise to cook foods, where we now have this lack of understanding for how to cook. So we go about utilizing these prepackaged, pre-measured proteins in an attempt to develop a means to meet the needs that we have. The marketing for these protein-fortified beverages, for these protein-fortified foods, often hinges on the range of purported benefits. These typically include enhanced muscle growth and repair, increased fullness leading to weight loss, improved metabolism, better recovery from exercise, cognitive benefits, a host of benefits that can come about from this simple thing. And once again, we have to be very careful because we do not have a panacea here. We do not have something that is going to cure all of our ills. For athletes and for fitness enthusiasts, there is a link between protein and muscle synthesis that has been well established if the exercise is at an intensity high enough to require additional protein synthesis. Protein does provide those amino acids, but it's not about when we get those amino acids, And it's not about how much of those amino acids that we have. It's simply about being in a positive nitrogen balance, a positive amino acid balance. But it's not just about amino acids. It's also about having the appropriate amount of carbohydrates, the appropriate amount of fats within the diet. Proteins do provide the amino acids necessary for repairing muscle damaged during exercise, but once again, only if we have the appropriate level of stimulus on those muscles. When we start looking at this idea about protein supplementation, there is this logical conclusion that seems to be made off the fact that if I need to build muscle, I must need additional protein. But the problem is we don't actually look at how much protein are we actually getting in our foods and how much additional protein that we actually need. And this is where we have to go back and look at the science. Yes, we do need some additional protein. But for most of us, we are meeting that protein requirement just through the foods that we are eating. We do not need all this additional protein that gets thrown at us based off of what our typical diet happens to be. We start looking at this idea about how can we use these proteins? How can we use these protein-infused foods, these protein-infused beverages? What can we look at as relates to the idea about needing additional proteins? And this goes into the idea that more protein in the diet leads to higher amounts of satiety, higher amounts of fullness, where we get this idea sold to us that proteins will lead to greater amounts of fullness. Proteins will take longer to digest down. Proteins will, quote unquote, increase caloric burning throughout the day. Without understanding that you don't burn calories, yes, you can expend energy. Yes, it does require more energy to break down proteins to their amino acid components than it does to break down other of the macronutrients. But that's only true under certain conditions. Yes, if I'm eating a steak, it's going to require more energy to break that down than when I'm eating a potato, based off of the thermogenic effect, the actual chemical reactions taking place within those two foods. However, if instead of eating the steak, I'm now consuming protein in a powdered form, the amount of energy used to break down those proteins becomes less because the proteins are already broken down. This is where we start looking at this idea about, okay, I'm going to use additional protein in order to curb appetite, in order to reduce the amount of foods that are being consumed under this misguided notion that I'm going to reduce total calorie intake. And by reducing total calorie intake, I'm going to automatically lose weight. And that's not true. The protein-fortified beverages, the protein-fortified foods become a popular choice for those who are being sold it as a means for weight loss. It's the idea that we're replacing low protein snacks, low protein meals with high protein snacks, high protein meals, but reducing other macronutrients. If I'm eating whole foods, doing that can lead to a prolonging of fullness or a pushing away of the plate sooner than if I was eating nothing but higher amounts of carbohydrates within the meal. It's crucial to critically examine that scientific evidence, that scientific claim, when we start looking at the amplification of the idea, particularly to the general sedentary population, that protein becomes essential for optimal health, and we need to supplement the amount of protein that we have within our diet in order to reach the optimal health. How much protein do we actually need in a day? Well, if I'm just living my life, I need between 0.8 and 1.1 grams. If I'm being more active, that's going to go up to about 1.5 grams, and those are grams per kilogram. If I'm trying to lose weight, that's going to be about 1.87 to 2.5 grams per kilogram body mass. If you look at the evidence out there for the exercisers, you can safely consume without having any adverse effects in terms of metabolic effects by going up to between 3 and 5 grams per kilogram body mass. But that doesn't mean I have to get up to that level. It doesn't mean I have to consume that much. It doesn't mean I have to constantly be consuming additional amounts of protein. If we start looking at average persons, the average person in terms of body mass, in terms of amount of protein they should have in a day, is going to be between about 50 and 75 grams total in a day. The more I weigh, the more I'm going to need protein. The less I weigh, maybe a little bit less. The more active I am, slightly higher. The less active I am, slightly lower. But we don't get that sold to us. We don't get sold to us the fact that if I'm trying to gain muscle mass, if I'm trying to gain bone mass, if I'm trying to increase my lean body mass, we talk about having additional protein in and around workouts so as to increase the anabolic response to exercise. It's not about when we consume that protein, because it takes between 24 and 72 hours to have a protein recovery following workout. Yes, if I am having more amino acids in my diet after a workout, I'm going to reduce the amount of protein breakdown. But that's not because of the benefit I get from having the protein. That's because I'm slowing down hormonal responses that would otherwise break down proteins in order to meet metabolic needs. I'm giving the body the nutrients that the body would need and the body would break down in order to get there. Which means that if we're consuming adequate amount of protein throughout the day, we don't need that additional amount of protein, nor is it that we need it right after workout. We don't have to consume protein immediately after workout. We don't have to go and drink the protein shakes. We don't have to have the extra protein after a workout. It's actually more important to have additional carbohydrates in and around the workout than it is to have additional protein in and around the workout. And that's simply to control the amount of inflammatory hormones and the amount of counter-regulatory hormones that are trying to free up fuel sources so that we can go ahead and continue to have appropriate metabolic responses following exercise. The benefit that we get from that extra protein is not a linear response, which means that the more protein we get doesn't automatically transcribe to having a greater amount of protein being built with the muscles. Does it automatically transcribe to having a longer amount of satiety, a longer amount of fullness in a 1-to-1 ratio or in a 1-to-2 ratio? It's not linear. There is no linear equation that we have been able to develop within the research, within the modeling, to say that this amount of protein will promote fullness for this amount of time, that this amount of protein will lead to this amount of additional muscle mass, additional amount of bone mass. We have a certain amount of amino acids that we have to get from our diet, those are the essential amino acids, where if I have those in my meals in and around workout, I'm going to have a better benefit from the workout. But it's not simply because I'm having those essential amino acids. It's because I'm having fuels that are necessary in order to allow for appropriate repair, appropriate response to the workout. Where over the day, I need to make sure I get the correct amount of grammage of those essential amino acids throughout the day, along with the branched-chain amino acids throughout the day, along with the non-essential amino acids throughout the day. I need to make sure I'm having the total protein intake throughout the day so as to make sure that I'm getting the appropriate amino acids to have the appropriate building blocks in order to maintain protein turnover throughout the day. And that's the key here, throughout the day. It's not about a single ideal protein source. It's not about having a single protein meal as the key to having this ability to have prolonged satiety, prolonged protein turnover in terms of building proteins. When we start looking at this idea about the protein sources, one of the things we have to look at is it an isolated protein powder or is it a combined protein powder? And this is where people get kind of bent out of shape in terms of their own ideology, their own biases about protein. The evidence that we have shows that a non-isolated protein powder is actually better metabolically than the isolated protein powder. You don't have to spend the extra amount of money on those isolates in order to get the best type of protein in terms of beneficial responses from having additional protein in the diet. The clarity that we get from the protein, this is where we start looking at this idea about, these clear proteins, which is now one of the big trends that's out there in terms of the idea about getting these proteins, particularly these protein powders in beverage form. This idea about having these clear beverages. It's a marketing trap. It's a trap that allows for people to say, well, there's not this additional stuff. There's no artificial stuff within it, where you get the natural or the clean idea, where we have these protein isolates that are extracted from whey, extracted from peas, extracted from soys, that have had all the other stuff removed, where it's just the protein, where there is none of the fat, none of the sugars, none of the lactose, none of the other things that we find within the protein powders that make it a more pured or a more purified type of protein. Where we get these people who will sell these ideas as being better for you, but at the same time sell the idea that processed becomes unhealthy, without understanding that you have processed this protein from its natural state into this quote unquote purified state, where we hydrolyze the protein isolates into its individual amino acid components, where we then have to add stuff back into it in order to provide enough nutrients within these powders to allow for all the benefits that we ascribe to these protein powders, where we remove the natural occurring sweeteners, the natural occurring sugars that are within them, but then have to somehow add back in sweeteners, somehow add back in other things that will allow us to find it palatable. The palatability of these clear proteins, where we have removed all of the stuff that we would normally look at as providing some of the flavorants, whether it is fats, whether it is thickening agents, whether it is the sugars that are naturally occurring. We've extracted all those, and then what we do, we add back in things like citric acid. We add back in things like the non-nutritive sweeteners, in an attempt to make it palatable, under the guise that these sucrose, this lactose, these naturally occurring sugars are somehow going to be of detriment to the individual, without understanding that we need those sugars in order to do normal metabolism. Yes, if I'm lactose intolerant, I want to limit the amount of lactose that I might be consuming from these protein substances, which means I may want to make sure that I'm consuming a plant-based protein substance if I'm going to use the powders, even if it is that pure, clear protein idea where I have extracted all of the stuff. Within this, we also start looking at these ideas about the fact that I've extracted all of these fats, extracted all of these sugars, and it's somehow going to now be a lower quote-unquote calorie thing. But I'm adding that protein into things that doesn't necessarily automatically have a lower quote-unquote calorie to it. While there are a number of non-nutritive sweeteners that are there, a lot of the ideas around these products is that it's going to be a no artificial thing. It's going to somehow be a natural thing, where this misconception is that natural automatically means better, or natural automatically means no side effect to it, without understanding that everything has the potential to have a side effect to it, whether it is the fact that some of the sugars that are contained within some of these non-nutritive sweeteners can get metabolized into other types of products, both by the microbiome within the gut, as well as within our cells, where we might have absorption taking place, even though the amount of absorption of these non-nutritive sweeteners tends to be less than we get with the normal sugars. The potential use for these products can lead to additional side effects coming into play, based off the fact that I see it, okay, it's now a lower calorie, and since it's a lower calorie, I can have more of this, without understanding that adding the additional non-nutritives may have secondary side effects to it: gastrointestinal distress, bloating, gas, those types of issues that can come about, even having some sort of interactions between the protein powder and those non-nutritive or those additive chemicals that get put into these powders in order to make it shelf stable, in order to not allow it to cake together. And this is where, if we start looking at, well, what's also added into that? Oh, we got these celluloses that are there. And people will say, oh, well, that cellulose is quote unquote plant is quote unquote wood pulp. But once again, it's cellulose. Cellulose is the same thing that we see with with fiber coming from plants, where if I am increasing the amount of cellulose within a meal, it can cause some sort of gastrointestinal distress to come about if I'm not used to having that much cellulose in what I'm eating, that much fiber in what I'm eating. Or if it happens to have a whole bunch of the non-nutritive sweeteners, in particular the sugar alcohols, that can have adverse effects on gastrointestinal functions, or where we simply just minimize the amount of sweetener that we put into these things that can make it not very palatable, that do not allow me to consume what I need to consume. The other thing we start looking at in terms of a lot of these protein mixtures that get put into the products that we're buying, particularly within the beverages, particularly within the coffees that is now the trend that's out there in terms of this protein coffee, which we'll get to in a second here, is the misconception about the fact that just because it's there, it's automatically get absorbed. Just because it's there, it's automatically going to have an effect for me. And that's where we have to look at the bioavailability of the substance. And this is where we have to look at the idea about what do I actually get from the substance? Do I get all of the amino acids that are necessary for having appropriate muscle synthesis? Just because I'm increasing the amount of protein doesn't necessarily mean I'm increasing the correct amount of amino acids that are necessary for those substances. Just because I'm increasing the amount of protein doesn't mean I'm also going to be increasing the amount of all of the other macronutrients that I need in a day in order to make sure that I'm at a nutrient balance. So I may be thinking, okay, I'm going to reduce the amount of substances that I'm consuming because I need to lose weight. And so I'm going to increase the amount of protein, but decrease the amount of carbs, decrease the amount of fats. But I need to have carbohydrates. I need to have fats in my diet. It's one of the biggest misconceptions out there that we want to eliminate carbohydrates. We want to eliminate fats. And this is where we get into a lot of the malnutrition that can come about from having a protein-only diet. This is one of the things we talked about in the Dogmatic Diets book as it relates to the carnivore diet. And when we published the kind of teaser YouTube video, there's a lot of negative comments about the fact that, well, what do you mean you're not going to have these vitamins? What do you mean you're not going to have these other nutrients? A lot of the fat-soluble vitamins get lost if we're over-consuming proteins and under-consuming fats, which means that we can't actually get into a vitamin deficit from consuming a lot of these kind of clear or clean protein sources that have eliminated a lot of the fats that are there based off the idea that I'm going to have a quote-unquote lighter meal, a lighter substance. Where the other thing we have to look at is what type of amino acids is within the protein. This is where we have to look at not just my lactose tolerance. That is, can I break down lactose into glucose, but what are the sources of that protein? Where, once again, this is where a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who are within the brosphere and the manosphere, talk about you don't want to have plant proteins because it has phytosterols in it, particularly phytosterols that mimic estrogen. While that's true, it doesn't tell the whole story. We need to have some of those phytosterols. Some of those phytosterols actually have metabolic benefit to them, actually have antioxidants properties to them, actually have anti-inflammatory properties to it, actually have benefit to them. Where once again, if I'm eating my plant and my animal within my diet, if I'm mixing plant protein with animal protein, if I'm getting an actual complete diet as opposed to a selected diet, I'm going to get all of those substances within it. We also have to look at, okay, how much protein am I actually getting? And how much of that protein is actually available to me? How much am I actually getting from what I'm consuming in the powders versus what I should be getting from all of the foods that I am eating? And this is where we get into that squabble about, well, you want to minimize the amount of processed foods and ultra-processed foods that you're consuming, processed drinks and ultra-processed drinks that you're consuming. but you're consuming a processed food, a processed drink, when you're consuming these things that have the added protein into it, even if it's labeled as quote unquote natural or quote unquote clean or quote unquote light or quote unquote healthy, all of which are terms that are throwaway terms, stuff we talked about previously. It's marketing terms. All those things that we just quote unquote labeled, all of those healthies and lights and cleans and healthy, they're marketing tools. They're things to make us think that it's something better for us. The healthfulness of these protein powders, these protein beverages, these protein infused products, the healthfulness is a relative contextualized idea that is not intrinsically brought to our attention. We get marketed that that it's favorable compared to this, compared to that. It's marketable against this discouraged, less favorable product, this discouraged food choice that we happen to have, which goes into this idea that is now almost very popular if you start looking at some of the drink trends, particularly some of the trends that get thrown at us within social media and based off of the influence that we see in social media. And that's the idea of the protein-infused coffees. It's even in some of the advertisements that I see coming from a lot of the coffee shops, where it's even packaged in some of the pre-made coffee drinks that are at the store. And what it is it's this idea that we're taking this kind of clear protein, this protein where we've extracted all the other things and placed just the amino acids that are within the protein into this beverage. And it shouldn't come as a surprise based off of the fad, off of the trend that we see in terms of this added protein into everything, because coffee has the benefit to us. Coffee has the benefit in terms of regulating the response to adenosine. That's going to allow for neurons to function properly. That's going to have a dopaminergic and serotonergic effect within the central nervous system. That's going to have a cholinergic effect, epinephrine, norepinephrine, peripherally within the body. That's going to increase my energetic state, my feeling of being energized, my feeling of being alert. But then we also toss onto that this idea about having additional protein, and that additional protein allowing me to have benefit from being able to build more muscles, having benefit of being able to exercise properly and have proper recovery from it. Where we're tying this in with this low carb, this low sugar, high protein ideology about diet that is currently one of the big central trends, one of the big central fads that's there, where we're adding whey protein, adding pea protein, adding soy protein into the coffee that we're drinking, into the coffee beverages that we're drinking, without understanding that certain things are changed when we start having heating and cooling of the amino acids, heating and cooling of the protein. That doesn't necessarily change the chemical structure of the amino acid, but can change the bioavailability of stuff, where we have a lot of these protein powders, a lot of these protein added beverages that will increase certain amounts of vitamins that we have within our diet, that can actually change the amount of vitamins, the amount of minerals that we have within the diet, that can impact the absorption rate of a lot of the vitamins, a lot of the minerals that we have. Where if we're going to increase our protein, we also have to increase various other types of vitamins that are there, where we have to worry about certain types of chemicals, certain types of molecules that we find within the stomach that's going to impact the ability to digest and absorb specific types of vitamins, specific types of nutrients that are there, where we have to make sure that we have the correct amount of intrinsic factors there so that we don't lose out on any of the B12 that we might get, particularly if we're going to add those vitamins, add those minerals into the substances. And so when we start looking at all these ideas that are there, we have a whole bunch of faddish marketing that comes into play that doesn't necessarily line up with all of the science that we have about protein and about the necessity for protein within our nutrient balance. And then once again, we have to go back to the nutrient balance idea as relates to this, where yes, if I am highly metabolically active, I want to make sure that I have enough protein in order to have appropriate levels of recovery, appropriate levels of protein synthesis, of muscle synthesis, so that I can grow tissues I need to grow, so I can maintain tissues I need to maintain, so that I remain healthy. Yes, if I have more protein in my meals, I may feel fuller for longer periods of time. However, that's not always the case if the protein is being drunk versus if the protein is being eaten. And this is where we have to remember that not everything is equal. Not everything is equivalent. Liquid protein is different than solid protein in terms of all of the thermogenic effects as it relates to breakdown of the materials, the amount of time it takes to digest. Where one of the big selling points that we have with a lot of these protein powders, a lot of these protein drinks, is that it is easily digestible, easily absorbed, readily digestible, readily absorbed. And what that means is that we're actually losing that benefit that we get from having additional protein in the diet as it relates to the ability to maintain fullness. Because we want to maintain fullness if we're trying to put ourselves into a nutrient imbalance, a nutrient deficit, in an attempt to lose body mass, in an attempt to break down body tissues to meet that nutrient balance that we need. One of the things that we have to remember when people start talking about this, and this is one of the things that was one of the kind of counterpoints to having more protein in the diet for the longest period of time, is that it's somehow going to have an additional tax on your kidney functions, is somehow going to be detrimental to kidney functions. And just like we talked about when we were talking about creatine just a little while ago, it's been debunked with ample amounts of research. If I have family history of kidney disease, if I personally have a kidney disease, if I have a family history of cholesterol issues, if I personally have cholesterol issues, I want to make sure that I am limiting the total amount of protein that's being consumed so as to not have abnormal effects on liver, abnormal effects on the kidney that I'm already predisposed to having. But even then, we can go ahead and have consumption of protein up to and beyond that 1 gram per kilogram of body mass that we usually look at as having a negative effect, where we want to get into higher amounts of protein, understanding that higher amounts of protein puts me into a nutrient bonus for protein. And if I am trying to do this on a grammage amount of food being consumed, may cost me in terms of the amount of grammage I'm eating in terms of carbohydrates, in terms of fats, which can lead me to needing to utilize some of the stores that I have, where excessive amounts of amino acids, that bonus amount of amino acids, it doesn't get stored if I'm not storing it as protein. Very little amino acids get broken down into their carbohydrate components and then stored as either carbohydrates or stored as lipids, which is why people who are trying to go on drastic weight loss, on significant amounts of weight loss, they'll get put onto a higher protein diet, usually on a liquid protein diet. And that liquid protein diet is going to have higher amounts of protein, lower amounts of fats, lower amounts of carbohydrates, with the implicit understanding that I'm going to have to break down all of the stores of carbohydrates, all the stores of lipids to meet carbohydrate and lipid requirements, because I cannot chemically convert all those excessive amounts of amino acids into all the other nutrients. It's one of the benefits that we get from having this excessive amounts of amino acids if we're trying to use excessive amounts of amino acids to help me lose weight. And so when we start looking at this idea about the faddishness of the protein added foods, the protein infused beverages, the additional protein in all of the foods that we can get from the supermarket, the fact that we have this idea about the benefit that I get from the additional protein, we have to kind of take a step back. We have to understand what is being sold to us. We have to understand that what is being sold to us is not necessarily a scam. It's not necessarily a falsehood, but it's just not completely true. There's truth to it, but it's not completely true. Yes, the idea about the protein powders as being a convenience is true, but it's on a spectrum. Yes, the whey proteins have benefit to it, but it's on a spectrum. Yes, the pea protein has benefit to it, but it's on a spectrum. Yes, soy protein has benefit to it, but it's on a spectrum. Yes, excessively refined, excessively isolated, excessively purified proteins have a benefit, but it's on a spectrum. The more refined that protein source does not necessarily make that refined protein source that much better than the unrefined, the unhydrolyzed, the unisolated protein. Once again, if we look back at the research is there, protein blends have a better benefit to them than the isolated proteins. Protein blends are better for you than the isolated proteins. Eating real protein is better than consuming protein in a beverage. Looking at protein-fortified foods that have added protein into it. A lot of the yogurts that we see, a lot of the cereals that have added protein to it, because I'm consuming it in foods, it can add to the level of fullness that is there as I have to digest all of the stuff within the foods in order to get to that additional protein. We do not have to excessively worry about the overconsumption of protein as relates to detriment to kidney, detriment to liver, unless I happen to have that pre-existing condition. But at the same time, I don't want to have excessive amounts of protein consumption at the detriment or at the cost of underconsumption of the other macronutrients that are necessary, or more importantly, the micronutrients that I get from consuming foods that have fat, that have sugars within them. The marketing strategies that get employed by the beverage industries, by the food industries, are undeniably effective. The influence on social media, showcasing their toned physiques and their active lifestyle that promote these products, create an aspirational ideal that we try to get to. The antidotes, which we know are not evidence, highlighting rapid transformations, lead to a perception that these products are necessary. It creates this psychological pull. This is where the fadding comes into play. We associate all of these things with the protein that's in the products that are being sold. That we are somehow going to be missing out if we do not have this additional stuff within our diet. The convenience that gets perceived about having this easy to add powder, this easy to add supplement to, just stir it into a glass of water, shake it into your water bottle. It has an appeal about ease, an appeal about convenience, but it drops the mindfulness approach that we need to have to our nutrition. It takes away the focus about eating, about the nutrients, to the convenience of getting the substance. Just have this one fortified beverage, even though people talk about fortified foods as being bad for you. Well, you don't want to have this bread because it's fortified with vitamins, but have this beverage that's fortified with protein. What's the difference? Fortified is fortified. All we're doing is adding stuff into the product that wasn't there to start with. Issues and ideas that we've talked about. We've talked about some of the myths and misconceptions that relates to some of the dietary practices that a lot of us like to follow. We start looking at this idea about the protein-fortified beverages, the protein-fortified food products. We have to take a step back. We have to realize what is being sold. I have to take a step back and I have to look at what is my diet already? What am I missing in my diet? And what will the additional protein do for me? This is where I have to do the calculations. How many grams of protein do I need in a day based on my nutrient balance, based on my nutrient requirements? If I'm already meeting those protein requirements, is additional protein going to do any benefit for me? Am I going to take this additional protein at the cost of not getting some of the micronutrients that I need that I'll get from eating other things? Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully you got a bit out of the conversation here as it relates to some of the faddishness of the protein-fortified beverages, the protein-fortified foods that now seems to be ubiquitous within the supermarkets, within the coffee shops, within the restaurants, within the juice bars that we go to. If you have questions or comments, please make sure you leave it for us. We're more than happy to expand this conversation, even do some writing on it within the Substack for those of you who follow us on the Substack. Please make sure that you're subscribed to follow us here on the podcast. If you like what we put out there, please make sure you give us that 5-star rating, that big thumbs up. Let us know that we're doing a good job. Please make sure you're following us here on the podcast as well as following us on YouTube. The written stuff is Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post to Instagram and to Threads and now on Blue Sky. Please stay tuned for future discussions, future conversations about how the human body works in an attempt to dispel a lot of the misconceptions that we have about how our body works and about what we can do to live a healthy lifestyle.